Blackstone Audio presents The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich A. Hayek. It is seldom that liberty of any kind is lost all at once. David Hume. To the Socialists of all parties. Foreword. Although this book might in some respects have been different if I had written it in the first instance with American readers primarily in mind, it has by now made for itself too definite, if unexpected, a place in this country to make any rewriting advisable. Its republication in a new form, however, more than 10 years after its first appearance, is perhaps an appropriate occasion for explaining its original aim and for a few comments on the altogether unforeseen, and in many ways curious, success it has had in this country. The book was written in England during the war years and was designed almost exclusively for English readers. Indeed, it was addressed mainly to a very special class of readers in England. It was in no spirit of mockery that I dedicated it to the socialists of all parties. It had its origin in many discussions which, during the preceding 10 years, I had with friends and colleagues whose sympathies had been inclined toward the left, and it was in continuation of those arguments that I wrote The Road to Serfdom. When Hitler came into power in Germany, I had already been teaching at the University of London for several years, but I kept in close touch with affairs on the continent, and was able to do so until the outbreak of war. What I had thus seen of the origins and evolution of the various totalitarian movements made me feel that English public opinion, particularly among my friends who held advanced views on social matters, completely misconceived the nature of those movements. Even before the war, I was led by this to state in a brief essay what became the central argument of this book. But after war broke out, I felt that this widespread misunderstanding of the political systems of our enemies, and soon also of our new ally, Russia, constituted a serious danger which had to be met by a more systematic effort. Also, it was already fairly obvious that England herself was likely to experiment after the war with the same kind of policies which I was convinced had contributed so much to destroy liberty elsewhere. Thus, this book gradually took shape as a warning to the socialist intelligentsia of England. With the inevitable delays of wartime production, it finally appeared there early in the spring of 1944. This date will, incidentally, also explain why I felt that in order to get a hearing, I had somewhat to restrain myself in my comments on the regime of our wartime ally, and to choose my illustrations mainly from developments in Germany. It seems that the book appeared at a propitious moment, and I can feel only gratification at the success it had in England, which, though very different in kind, was quantitatively no smaller than it was to be in the United States. On the whole, the book was taken in the spirit in which it was written, and its argument was seriously examined by those to whom it was mainly addressed, excepting only certain of the leading politicians of the Labour Party, who, as if to provide an illustration for my remarks on the nationalist tendencies of socialism, attacked the book on the ground that it was written by a foreigner. The thoughtful and receptive manner in which it was generally examined by persons who must have found its conclusions running counter to their strongest convictions was deeply impressive. The most representative example of British criticism of the book from a left-wing point of view is probably Mrs. Barbara Wooten's courteous and frank study, Freedom Under Planning, London, George Allen and Unwin, 1946. It is often quoted in the United States as an effective refutation of my argument, though I cannot help feeling that more than one reader must have gained the impression that, as one American reviewer expressed it, it seems substantially to confirm Hayek's thesis. Chester I. Barnard, Southern Economic Journal, January, 1946. The same applies also to the other European countries where the book eventually appeared, and its particularly cordial reception by the post-Nazi generation of Germany. When copies of a translation published in Switzerland at last reached that country, was one of the unforeseen pleasures I derived from its publication. Rather different was the reception the book had in the United States, when it was published here a few months after its appearance in England. I had given little thought to its possible appeal to American readers when writing it. It was then 20 years since I had last been in America as a research student, and during that time I had somewhat lost touch with the development of American ideas. I could not be sure how far my argument had direct relevance to the American scene, and I was not in the least surprised when the book was, in fact, rejected by the first 3 publishing houses approached. I did not know then, as has since been admitted by a person advising one of the firms, that this appears to have been due not to any doubts of the success of the book, but to political prejudice, which went to the extent of representing the book as unfit for publication by a reputable house. See on this the statement by William Miller, quoted by W.T. Couch in The Sainted Book Burners, The Freeman, April 1955, page 423, and also William Miller, The Book Industry, a report of the Public Library Inquiry of the Social Science Research Council, New York, Columbia University Press, 1949, page 12. It was certainly most unexpected when, after the book was brought out by its present publishers, it soon began to sell at a rate almost unprecedented for a book of this kind, not intended for popular consumption. Not a little of this was due to the publication of a condensation of this book in the Reader's Digest, and I should like to pay here to the editors of this journal a public testimony to the extremely skillful manner in which this was done without my assistance. It is inevitable that the compression of a complex argument to a fraction of its original length produces some oversimplification, but that it was done without distortion, and better than I could have done it myself, is a remarkable achievement. And I was even more surprised by the violence of the reaction from both political wings, by the lavish praise the book received from some quarters, no less than by the passionate hatred it appeared to arouse in others. Contrary to my experience in England, in America, the kind of people to whom this book was mainly addressed seem to have rejected it out of hand as a malicious and disingenuous attack on their finest ideals. They appear never to have paused to examine its argument. The language used and the emotion shown in some of the more adverse criticism the book received were indeed rather extraordinary. To any reader who would like to see a specimen of abuse and invective, which is probably unique in contemporary academic discussion, I recommend a reading of Professor Herman Feiner's Road to Reaction, Boston, Little Brown and Company, 1945. But scarcely less surprising to me was the enthusiastic welcome accorded to the book by many whom I never expected to read a volume of this type, and from many more of whom I still doubt whether in fact they ever read it. And I must add that occasionally the manner in which it was used vividly brought home to me the truth of Lord Acton's observation that at all times sincere friends of freedom have been rare, and its triumphs have been due to minorities that have prevailed by associating themselves with auxiliaries, whose objects often differed from their own, and this association, which is always dangerous, has sometimes been disastrous. It seems hardly likely that this extraordinary difference in the reception of the book on the two sides of the Atlantic is due entirely to a difference in national temperament. I have since become increasingly convinced that the explanation must lie in a difference of intellectual situation at the time when it arrived. In England, and in Europe generally, the problems with which I dealt had long ceased to be abstract questions. The ideals which I examined had long before come down to earth, and even their most enthusiastic adherents had already seen concretely some of the difficulties and unlooked-for results which their application produced. I was thus writing about phenomena of which almost all my European readers had some more or less close experience, and I was merely arguing systematically and consistently what many had already intuitively felt. There was already a disillusionment about these ideals under way, which their critical examination merely made more vocal or explicit. In the United States, on the other hand, these ideals were still fresh and more virulent. It was only 10 or 15 years earlier, not 40 or 50 as in England, that a large part of the intelligentsia had caught the infection, And, in spite of the experimentation of the New Deal, their enthusiasm for the new kind of rationally constructed society was still largely unsoiled by practical experience. What, to most Europeans, had in some measure become vieux jeu was to the American radicals still the glittering hope of a better world, which they had embraced and nourished during the recent years of the Great Depression. Opinion moves fast in the United States, and even now it is difficult to remember how comparatively short a time it was before the road to serfdom appeared that the most extreme kind of economic planning had been seriously advocated, and the model of Russia held up for imitation by men who were soon to play an important role in public affairs. It would be easy enough to give chapter and verse for this, but it would be invidious now to single out individuals. Be it enough to mention that in 1934, the newly established National Planning Board devoted a good deal of attention to the example of planning provided by these four countries: Germany, Italy, Russia, and Japan. 10 years later, we had, of course, learned to refer to these same countries as totalitarian, had fought a long war with 3 of them, and were soon to start a Cold War with the 4th. Yet the contention of this book that the political development in those countries had something to do with their economic policies was then still indignantly rejected by the advocates of planning in this country. It suddenly became the fashion to deny that the inspiration of planning had come from Russia, and to contend, as one of my eminent critics put it, that it was a plain fact that Italy, Russia, Japan, and Germany all reached totalitarianism by very different roads. The whole intellectual climate in the United States at the time the road to serfdom appeared was thus one in which it was bound either profoundly to shock or greatly to delight the members of sharply divided groups. In consequence, in spite of its apparent success, the book has not had here the kind of effect I should have wished, or which it has had elsewhere. It is true that its main conclusions are today widely accepted. If 12 years ago it seemed to many almost sacrilege to suggest that fascism and communism are merely variants of the same totalitarianism which central control of all economic activity tends to produce, this has become almost a commonplace. It is now even widely recognized that democratic socialism is a very precarious and unstable affair, ridden with internal contradictions, and everywhere producing results most distasteful to many of its advocates. For this sobered mood, the lessons of events and more popular discussions of the problem are certainly more responsible than this book. The most effective of these was undoubtedly George Orwell's 1984. The author had earlier kindly reviewed this book. Nor was my general thesis as such original when it was published. Although similar but earlier warnings may have been largely forgotten, the dangers inherent in the policies which I criticized had been pointed out again and again. Whatever merits this book possesses consist not in the reiteration of this thesis, but in the patient and detailed examination of the reasons why economic planning will produce such unlooked-for results, and of the process by which they come about. It is for this reason that I rather hope that the time may now be more favorable in America for a serious consideration of the true argument of the book than it was when it first appeared. I believe that what is important in it still has to render its service, although I recognize that the hot socialism against which it was mainly directed, that organized movement toward a deliberate organization of economic life by the state as the chief owner of the means of production, is nearly dead in the Western world. The century of socialism, in this sense, probably came to an end around 1948. Many of its illusions have been discarded even by its leaders, and elsewhere